them.
Okay.
Marcia is a dear friend of ours, and she's been a tremendous help to our little town of Milford. Like so many of the towns in Hunterdon County, it seems like you're all alone and struggling against the state most of the time. And Marcia came when we were really struggling, helped us a lot, and we'll always appreciate your help, Marcia. I hadn't expected this slide to be up here, so I don't know if Janice did or not.
I did, I stuck that in.
Yeah, I was surprised, but it's kind of neat. This is an old, I think they call them block print of Milford. So if you could visualize Milford, the traffic light, you're coming from Frenchtown to Milford right in this direction, and that's the hill at Milford by the traffic light. And it's kind of neat. It has absolutely nothing to do with my talk of the Gibson House, but I just wanted to show you. When you look at the old pictures, you'll notice there's no trees in the picture. You'll notice there's not a lot of houses in Milford. But that's like probably, the church is there, the Presbyterian church that's still there. See it right here? That's by the traffic light. So that's probably around the time, when the hotel was in its prime. But it's kind of neat when you look at some of these old pictures, and I'll talk about that as we go through about the perspective of history. It's sometimes hard for us to visualize going back in time, because what was there. I think it's safe to say that most of us in here love history. And my wife, Linda, right here, and we moved to Milford 40 some years ago, and we opened up Chestnut Hill on the Delaware Inn. When I bought the house from Barbara Stem, she left me a bunch of old photo postcards. My next door neighbor, Kenny Meyer, left me a bunch of old postcards. And a lot of the guests started coming in. We thought we were going to be there 2 or 3 years, so history didn't mean anything to me. But the guests started asking about the training out front, about the town, about the river. And we were so fortunate in Milford to have our own newspaper way back when, the Milford Leader. And we had a somewhat famous photographer, George Washington Freeland, who took a lot of pictures. And most of this stuff is in County Historical Society. So we're also fortunate to have a super historical society that maintains so much of this. So I became involved with the history of our town and really got to love it. And I'm still studying. I still go to the building every now and then, and they have the old newspapers on microfiche. So I don't know if the county one that you have back there is on microfiche, but just about all the towns in Hunterdon County had their own newspaper, and most of them are on microfiche that you can go through and do a lot of research. One of the, Marcia mentioned that every day. I was going to say like every week there's something donated to the museum. Well, one of the items that was donated is what we have here today. It's the guest register from the Gibson Hotel. The Gibson Hotel was one of the most prominent buildings in Milford. It was a hotel right in the center of town for about 150 years. So in essence, it was the heart of the town. And my talk today is going to be on kind of 3 parts. The building the book came from, the Gibson House, and the guy who built the building. But it's, in summary, it's a history of the town of Milford. And although it's unique to Milford, it's not much different than the history of so many towns in this area. Again, it's hard for us to go back in time, but way back then, so this is before the Revolutionary War, somebody would routinely buy 100 or 1,000 acres of land. To make it valuable, they had to create jobs. So that somebody would build a shop, a ferry crossing, a mill, to create jobs and get people to move to the town. They would usually build a house within eyesight of that business. The house was usually the most significant house for miles around, in some cases one of only a few houses, and they would be commonly referred to as a mansion, or in Flemington's case, a castle, and they would usually name the town after the person. So when you think as you drive around out where we are, you come Phillipsburg and Riegelsville and Kintnersville and Robsville and Upper Black Eddy and Ewerstown, Flemington, the town would be named after that person that started it. And that's kind of the history of Milford. When I study the history of Milford, and in fact when you study the history of our country, it's so young and it's so different than most of the world. So when Cleopatra and the Romans were running around, ruling and reigning 2,000 years ago, there were already buildings like the pyramids that were 3,000, 5,000, 10,000 years old. All around the world we had ancient structures in places like China, Russia, India, certainly North Africa, Europe, South America, Central America. But what was in North America? You know, when you think about that, how unique North America is, we don't have 1,000-year-old buildings in North America. Now, we certainly know that there were Native Americans here, okay? And we have proof of Native Americans being here, okay? Found this down by my dock. So we find arrowheads everywhere. We have, just a second, I got a list here. We have Indian names everywhere. Places like Croton, Hackensack, Hoboken, Hohokus, Raritan, Watchung, the Musconecton River, and just about every stream in Hunterdon County has an Indian name on it. There in Frenchtown, they have the Nishi-Sackawik. We have the Harry Hokie in Milford. The one I love in Milford is the Queequeg-Womissaconk. So, there's a road in Flemington out past the Raritan Diner, Minnehaha. See? But the Indian names are everywhere. And if you train your eye as you're driving around, you will see these names everywhere. So we know the Indians were here, but they didn't leave any cities behind, any buildings behind. So when the Europeans came in to North America, they basically had a blank canvas before them to go anywhere they wanted to build anywhere they wanted to, and they really did. And so the story of Milford, the guy that was credited with starting Milford, I forgot my little machines here, is Thomas Lowry. As I study like the Revolutionary War, it's kind of like a football game or a baseball game. There's so many games within the game, and when I study Lowry, he really is a critical figure in the history of our Revolutionary War, and it's kind of neat to read about him. Lowry was born in Ireland in 1737. His dad died when he was 10 years old, and he came to our country with his mom and his uncle Thomas Patterson. Now, Thomas Patterson happened to be the father of William Patterson, who was the signer of the Constitution, the second governor of our state, and Patterson, New Jersey is named after him. And as I read about Thomas Lowry, it's amazing how many people in his life that were so important in the development of our country, like his uncle. He became a close friend of Samuel Fleming, lived in the Fleming Castle. Now remember, this is the castle. When it was built, again, this is back, what's the date on there, 1756? It was the biggest house for miles around. So he lived in the Fleming Castle with Flemings. He became a very prosperous business person. His first piece of property he bought from Mr. Fleming, and he opened up a shop in Flemington. So when you think of Flemington, I mean, basically its history is a shop town. We had Liberty Village, we had Flemington Furs, Flemington Cut Glass. The very first shop in Flemington was started by Mr. Fleming from the property, not Fleming, Mr. Lowry from the property he bought from Mr. Fleming. With that business, he became very successful, and it was very important in the history of the Revolutionary War because as a young teenager, he had a shop, not only selling things, but more importantly, getting things. Where do you get supplies? When he opened that shop in Flemington, the closest store, general store we would call them, to Flemington was in Pitchtown. So it was a big deal in Flemington, became very prosperous, but where does he get the stuff to sell in the shop? That would become very important for his career and the Revolutionary War. Fleming was elected to our provincial Congress in 1755, and he was put in charge of getting supplies for the troops. To the best of our knowledge, not Fleming, Lowry. Lowry was never in combat in the Revolutionary War, but he was in charge of getting supplies for Washington and the American troops. He was so good at it that the British knew he was doing this. Interestingly enough, his wife was also very instrumental in getting stuff. She was a big fundraiser for getting supplies for the troops. So Lowry knew where to get them. His wife was out collecting money to buy them, to try to supply. And if you read the history of Washington, it's amazing how they didn't have much. You know, you study, Valley Forge and you study Morristown. The troops were starving, so it was a constant battle with trying to get supplies for them. So the British knew about Lowry and getting supplies, and so they sent a posse out to get him one day. And to me, this is the important part of Lowry's life, because the Americans knew this British posse was coming out. The guy in charge of the British posse was a young British officer named Cornet Geary. His father was an admiral in the British Navy. Back then, militarily speaking, you don't get any bigger than that. So in my mind, Cornet Geary would have been kind of like a rock star with his troops. Everybody knew his father was an admiral. And they all respected him, they idolized him, he was a big deal. So he came out right up by South Hunterdon High School. The Americans kind of found him, the posse, and they shot and killed Cornet Geary. To the best of my knowledge, he was the only injury, fatality in the whole skirmish. His troops, we think of the British Army with these red coats and very professional. They were so shocked at this Cornet Geary getting killed there, they all ran. Okay. Cornet Geary is still buried there. There's a little trail up there called Cornet Geary Way, and he's still buried there. But the troops ran. Let's see what my next slide is here. There's the monument to Cornet Geary. I don't know if you can make the date right there in the middle. You see the date that he was killed, December 14th, 1776? That's the critical part of the story. He was killed like within 2 weeks of when Washington was planning his sneak attack on Trenton. So for us that live in the area, I think we're familiar with Bowman's Tower down there in Pennsylvania. The key to Bowman's Tower was Washington supposedly went up there because it's a high spot looking down at the river to make sure the boats were all hidden and everything. It was important for the Americans to do a sneak attack on Trenton. So Washington and his men, they're afraid and worrying about, is this going to be a surprise attack? Well, it turned out the British were so unnerved about Cornet Geary getting shot, they went in hiding for 2 weeks. They weren't going anywhere. The troops not only ran back, they didn't go anywhere for 2 weeks. They were hiding because it was such a big deal for them. And as we all know, the attack on Trenton turned out to be very successful. And it led to Washington crossing the Delaware and surprising them. Even though they had tons of problems and delays, the British didn't know they were coming. So it was very successful. Lowry was so good at what he did that both Lowry and his wife became very close friends of George Washington and Martha Washington. And I've never seen this, Marcia, but I've read in books where Washington came to visit Lowry in Flemington.
Martha was definitely there.
George was there.
The house that they lived in is gone now, but the foundation is there. It was where T-Berry's is today, or was. It just closed and they're moving. But down by the Flemington Monument, that house was the location of the Lowry house, and Mrs. Lowry was Samuel Fleming's daughter.
Yes.
So,
yeah, well, he lived in the house.
There's no evidence that Washington himself was there, but we do know Martha came.
I have a letter from the lady that was writing about her grandmother talking to Washington on the porch of Lowry's house.
Really?
Yeah. So I'm pretty sure
that's in our
Washington
collections.
and his wife were there.
That's in our collections.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's it. Yeah. Yeah, we have that.
Here's a snippet from a letter Washington wrote to Lowry. It said, "Be kind enough to make my compliments to Mrs. Lowry, to whose civilities both Mrs. Washington and myself are much indebted. I am, sir, your most obedient servant." Esther was such a close friend to them that she was the matron of honor for the very first presidential inaugurational ball in Trenton. Their kids were part of the procession and sang songs for Washington. After the Revolutionary War, Lowry had several key positions, across the county, and he started buying property. As I read through Lowry's life, he was buying he bought 1,000 acres of property, what we now call Frenchtown. He bought property in Philadelphia. He bought 1,000 acres of property, what we now call Milford. And we credit him as being the founder, the starter of Milford. He had a lot of children. One of his kids married into the Borden family, is in Bordentown. One of them married into Coryell from Lambertville. One of them married into Frelinghausen family, which was a political dynasty in New Jersey for years and years. He built a big mill. He bought the 1,000 acres of property in Milford. He built a big mill there. There used to be in Milford, way back, you know, before the Revolution. It burned down, so Milford was called Burnt Mills for quite a few years. So Lowry came in and built a new mill. He built a ferry crossing. You know, we take for granted, I was talking to somebody earlier about we have a real bridge in Milford you can go across. But in the old days, in fact, the town of Milford got its name from the mill and the ford. There was a place low enough on the water where you could actually ford the river or walk across the river if the river was low. So Lowry came in and built a ferry road crossing, which was much better than walking in the water. And he built the mill. And then he decides to build a house for his wife and his family. So in 1796, he built his house on the main street in Milford, which we call the Gibson House. I was mentioning earlier too, it was known as the Gibson House for like 150 years. This is one of the most prominent spots in Milford. If you could think of Milford today, the drive-in, what used to be the drive-in bank right in the center of town, that's where this hotel stood. So for 150 years, that was the hotel in the center of town, the Gibson House. I've seen all kinds of names of owners. In fact, the book on the top, it has Hans as the proprietor. Doc Buzzard was a proprietor at one time. I've never seen any reference to Gibson, or who Gibson was, but it was known as the Gibson House for over 150 years. The little, not so little, but the stone blocks, they were to be for people to get out of stagecoaches, or coaches. Kind of a neat picture. You see the back right-hand corner, there were the stables. So that's the funny little parking lot that's there today. So behind the drive-in bank in Milford, there's that funny little parking lot. Carol, you walk through it every day. That's where the stables were, where people could park their cars.
When was it torn down?
1950, I'll get there.
Okay, sorry.
That's a picture from the bridge looking towards the center of town. So the drive-in bank would be right here. This is the Presbyterian manse here, and that picture's kind of neat because it's got a second-story porch on it, which isn't there now. But you can see the prominence that that position had in the center of town. So my next part is, who would stay at the Gibson House? So we know they had a lot of people coming and going. To a certain extent, my wife and I can associate with this because we've had the inn there for 40 years. And like, you know, who would stay with us? I remember years ago, one of our guests was at the grocery store and overheard somebody talking at the cash register saying, you know, who would spend $100 to stay in Milford? Okay. For 200 years, people have been coming to Milford. And so this Gibson House was there, and the people came to Milford. Oh, there's another neat picture of the Gibson House. This is a more modern one. You see that the gas pumps in the car? That's maybe 1920s based on the car. And on the bottom, it's got Jeffries and Buzzard. So Jeffries was an owner, and then I think Buzzard was related to him. He became the owner. So that's maybe 1920. So 30 years later, they would tear that down. But man, it's such a neat building. Gone. Oh, I got it back up for a minute. Again, this was originally built as Lowry's house. This was going to be his house. But it became the hotel for 150 years because his wife didn't like it. I don't know what it is about women, but for some reason his wife didn't like it. So my wife and I were talking about it as we were coming in. We live right on the river. If they moved in on a hot summer day with no breeze, and horses going to the bathroom everywhere, okay? And the noise of, I mean, it was a busy street, as we're going to see when I talk about why people would come to Milford. I could see why she didn't like it, but for whatever reason, she didn't like it. So Lowry had to build a new house for his wife around the corner, and that's why his building became the hotel. So here's the new house he built around the corner. That's right next to where we are. This is where Kenny Meyer lived, Marcia, for years. Kenny and his wife Nan lived there for 30, 40 years. And so that was Lowry's house. The Lowrys lived there most of their life. They died there. The Lowrys are both buried in the old stone church in Kingwood. They have prominent stones in the ground there. So that was Lowry's house. The house had a terrible fire about, what, 15 years ago?
More than that, yeah.
Yeah, 20 years ago?
Over 20.
And our neighbors who live there now, they rebuilt the place, and so it lost a lot of its oldness, like the bay windows and that round-shaped window, and it's changed a lot, but it's one of the oldest houses in Milford. I had a survey here. Where was that?
It's right after.
This is a quote from a surveyor summary of Milford a few years before Lowry moved to town. There were but 2 houses in the mill where Milford is situated. So, can you imagine building like the Gibson house? When he built that, there was only like maybe 5 or 10 houses in the whole town. So like I said, these houses, these guys that bought the property and built the mill and built their big house, their houses literally were mansions and the biggest thing around for like 100 years. Why did people come to Milford? Milford's history, like Frenchtown and so many other towns, at that point of time, late 1800s, early 1900s, all these towns were just busting at the seams to grow and create jobs and raise families. And it's amazing the factories and the mills that came into the towns. This was the Keystone Whisk and Broom Company in Milford. Big job. The railroad, you can see the railroad tracks there? When the railroad came to town, that was huge. I mean, they literally rolled out the red carpet for the trains to come to town. And the trains, and so the Keystone factory would bring their supplies in, they would send the brooms and everything out. That was just one factory in town. This factory, by the way, is still here, these buildings. It became, after the whisk brooms, it became a silk factory for a while. Grant Sheets had a seed factory there. It was the beginning of the Catholic Church in Milford there. And Jack Updike has all of his Anderson windows and doors there now. So it's still used as a factory. This was the stem chair factory. So this was closer to town. The bridge is just behind us here. And on the left, that building is still there. It's just next to Maudie's. Maudie's little cafe, restaurant right there in the center town. That's this big stone building. But you can see the railroad tracks there. Once again, Stem's Chair Factory used to make big porch rockers. They would sell them for $1 each, and their big suppliers went up to Poconos. They would load the train with hundreds of these porch rockers to get up to the Poconos. So they were a customer in Milford. This is the Milford Oilcloth Factory, like I said, just a little bit down from the chair factory. Our paper mill. For 100 years, the biggest employer in the county. They had people coming and going all the time in Milford. This was right by the river. The building on the right, the big stone mill, is still the one there by the bridge. So this was the home of Thomas Flower. Originally, that's where Lowry built his stone mill, his wood mill was right there where the stone factory is. So the building on the right was the flour mill. The building on the left was the lumber mill. So they had a lot of people coming and going from Milford. That's our opera house. Milford had its own opera house. These towns back then were basically self-sufficient. They had their own newspapers, their own grocery store, their own church, their own school, their own opera house, and most of the people that lived there never left town. That's their whole life was right there. So Milford had an opera house, and in the guest book, there's a lot of things that, and I have some pictures of them, of the different troupes that would come and perform at the opera house. The opera house is still there, and it's a guy that owns it now has a world famous photo restoration company. So big bucks. People that have historic photographs, he works on them there. We had a railroad station. The railroad was so important for the development of our country. Back then, we had 20 trains a day passing through Milford. We had 7 trains every morning taking people to work in Philadelphia and New York, 7 trains in the afternoon coming home. Somebody was looking at the book earlier and saying, why would somebody from Milford stay at the Gibson house? When you look through the old newspapers, it's like once every other day, a train broke down somewhere. So you're supposed to go home on the 5 o'clock train, somewhere there's a train broke down, the train's not gonna come for another 3, 4, 5 hours or a day or two to get the wreck cleaned up. So a lot of people got there and they couldn't get out and they had to stay at the Gibson house. When we moved, we had a neighbor, Shorty Freiling. Back then, not all high schools had every program. So our neighbor Shorty wanted to be a school teacher. Well, the schools in Milford, high schools in Milford, which would have been Frenchtown, they didn't have a program. So he had to get on the train and go to school in Lambertville. Lambertville was the only school in the area that had a program for people that wanted to be teachers. And the war stories he had about missing the last train. You know, why were you late for school? Why didn't you show up for school? How come you didn't come home? So it was, you know, we just take for granted getting, you know, to work and back or getting to school and back. But, you know, when people took the trains, sometimes it was quite an ordeal. Here's a picture of a train coming to Milford. So this is our house right next to where the Lowry house was. So this would be late 1800s, the train coming. The trains all burn coal, of course, 20 trains a day. Everything would be covered with coal, dust. Linda and I took a trip to Scranton once, and some of our friends are train people. There's been a big deal to try to get the train to come back to Milford, okay? And the train people love their train, but their idea of a train is a big coal-burning train. And so we're in Scranton one day, and we were talking to some people, because Scranton has a big train museum and everything. And the one lady, she started laughing, and she said, my whole life I grew up, and we always did our wash on Sunday. And she always thought it was a religious thing to do your wash on Sunday. It turned out it was the only day the train didn't run. That's the only day they could do the wash. We can't imagine the coal dust that came out of the trains back then with 20 trains a day. One of the biggest cargoes that the train carried was coal. Kathy, you have the Gilbert Station up the road from us. Just that one place was an electric generating plant. They would bring in 100 trainload cars of coal a week, just for Gilbert. If you look at pictures of our old paper mill, they had a mountain of coal down at the paper mill. Everybody was burning coal back then. And that leads to another reason why people came to Milford. This is kind of a neat picture, looking from Pennsylvania across to Upper Black Eddy and Milford. And back then, Upper Black Eddy was really a bigger town than Milford. So this would have been, I want to guess maybe 1860, 1870. So the canal was in its heyday then. A lot of people from Upper Black Eddy would walk across the bridge and stay at the hotel. You look at the hill and there's no trees in the picture. Kind of a couple neat things. I should have brought a pointer. Obviously no trees in the hill. This is the church, and the graveyards were always well manicured gardens, and that kind of funny thing, they had a pathway that would go across the hill. And we've had people stay with us at the inn that tried to go back. They remember as young people walking across the hill. It was very common on Sunday. You couldn't work on Sunday, okay? It was very common on Sunday to walk through the graveyards. They were all manicured gardens and pay your respect, and they would walk across the mountain over to Holland Township, I guess, Kathy. A lot of people from Upper Black Eddy, from Bridgeton Township, would stay at the Gibson house. We had the toll bridge there. Everybody that crossed that bridge had to pay. There was a toll for every animal, for every person, every buggy. That was the toll house. The foundation for that toll house is still there. You can see the sliding gate on the toll bridge. This is kind of a little neat thing about the picture. You see right here how they're different colors? That means that picture's taken after 1901. In 1901, we had, I'm saying 1901, I think that's right. We had a big flood, and so people that live on the river, they always have their markers are the flood of 1903. I guess it was 1903. 1903, the flood of 1955. The Regalsville Bridge came down and hit Milford. The railroad had telegraphs at the time, so the people in Milford knew that the Regalsville Bridge was coming down. And the first piece of bridge came down, and it hit our bridge broadside, and the current actually swept it underneath the bridge, and they survived. And it was just this, everybody was so excited because the Milford Bridge survived. The next section came down and hit it direct and took out that section of the Milford Bridge. And the piece of Riegelsville Bridge that hit it ended up in an island just south of Milford. They went down and got all the wood and brought it back to Milford and sold it to the Bridge Commission, and they rebuilt the Milford Bridge with the Riegelsville Bridge, so it's two colors. And so when you look at pictures, it gives you a way to date the bridge. So this picture is after the 1903 flood, but the toll house caught on fire and burned down, so it's not there anymore. There's a little guard shed there. But that was a huge business back then. This was a huge business on the river. So as we've looked at some of the old pictures of Milford, I mentioned several times about no trees in the picture. As our country was developing back then, lumber was the primary source of fuel. And when you think what's south of Milford, as far as early America, Trenton and Camden and Philadelphia and Wilmington and Baltimore, they had a desperate need for lumber, and they called it the tree line. The tree line kept getting further and further away from this civilization of people. North of us in Pennsylvania and upstate New York, in Pennsylvania, they always had coal, but they didn't know what to do with it. The Europeans had soft coal, Pennsylvania had hard coal. They knew they had coal. To them it was useless because nobody knew how to burn it, but they always had plenty of trees up there. All year long they would be cutting trees down. Whenever the river would come up, they would send these 100 and 200 foot rafts of lumber down the river, trying to get lumber to all these people that needed lumber. They didn't go in the river at night. I mean, there's no motor on these things. There's a couple guys with what do you call them? Oars or rudders in the back. At night, they all had to pull over somewhere. When you think of the river, I mentioned Upper Black Eddy earlier. There's a place north of us called Sands Eddy. On Old River Road in Holland Township, Kathy, there was an eddy there. The eddies were so important back then. That's where the current, there is no current. The river comes around the bend, and when it does, the river goes the wrong way. There's an eddy where these rafts could get out of the water, to get out of the current. They were important because at night, all these guys had to pull over somewhere. There's reports in Upper Black Eddy of up to 50 raft people a night spending nights at the hotels. You can imagine how that hotel was at night, right? And I'm sure some of them spent the night in Milford. One of the neat stories about these raft peoples, and there's books been written about the raft people, it was really dangerous getting these rafts downriver. Up in Easton, if you go to Easton today, there's still 3 old railroad bridges up there. They were there back then. Trying to navigate a 100 or 200 foot raft through the bridges and all the other boats, they would lose 12 or 15 rafts a day just in Easton trying to get down. When they finally figured out how to burn the coal in Pennsylvania, because of all the war stories they had with the rafts, they knew they couldn't depend on the river. So they built that canal on the Pennsylvania side. So that's around 1820, 1830s when the canal was built, and it became the primary source of getting the coal down, and the coal became the second source of fuel for our country. But these canal guys had to get down. It was a dangerous trip getting down. If they were successful and getting their raft down to wherever they were supposed to go, how did they get back home? And there's this whole story about they had to walk home back to upstate New York or Pennsylvania with their pockets full of money. Okay? What a life. A lot of war stories. Here's a train coming. This is right out coming out of Milford. That's the Milford Bridge behind you. And again, you can see the cloud of smoke coming. I put this picture in because it's the photographer that we had, I mentioned George Friedland, that's his writing on the bottom. He had a whole sequence of photo cards where he would actually write on the bottom. This is the Pocono Express. Back around 1900, if you were in Philadelphia or New York in the summer, it was not nice. Everybody was burning coal. Everybody had an outhouse. The streets were dirt. The horses went to the bathroom. Everybody wanted to get fresh country air. Okay? The rich people would get on the train, take the Pocono Express up to the Poconos. People that didn't have so much money would go to places like the hotel in Stockton, the hotels in Frenchtown, the hotel in Milford. they knew about fresh country. I mean, anybody with half a brain would know the air in Milford would be better than the air in Philadelphia or New York at that time of year. So all the river towns were resort towns for people trying to get fresh country air. One of the neat things about the Pocono Express, I was out front working, I don't know, 35 years ago, and a car stopped by with a lady and her grandfather. He was related to the family that grew up in our house, and he wanted to see the house before he died. And he's telling me a story about how his sister got run over by the train right in front of my house and it cut her arm off. She's buried in our cemetery in Milford. She lived to be 90 years old. And it was so hard for me to comprehend because most of the time we lived there and the train came by, it was like 5 miles an hour. It was like a toy for us. And the guests that we had would all go out and wave at the train, and the train guys were buddies of ours. And I can't imagine, how could somebody get run over by the train? One day I'm at the Historical Society building in Flemington. I'm reading through the old Milford Leader, and they talk about a train going a distance from, I don't know, Lambertville to Frenchtown, a distance of 12 miles in 10 minutes. I was thinking, 12 miles in 10 minutes, that's more than a mile a minute. That's 72 miles an hour in 1900. This Pocono Express was coming through Milford at 70 miles an hour. And once I read that, I said, now I know how people could get run over by the train. In fact, the guy that took this photograph, George Washington Freeland, he was digging a cesspool in his backyard. He lived right in the center of town. He was digging a cesspool. He was carrying buckets of dirt to dump down by the river. Train ran over him and killed him. Yeah. So if we saw a train come by today at 70 miles an hour, I mean, that would be kind of a big deal. This is back in 1900. But the river towns were resort towns back then. They still are today. I mean, we get people from around the world just fall in love with the Delaware River Valley. It's such a unique part of our country. Now we get into some of the guest book. Names in the guest book. So we were just looking at this one earlier. You see the name on the bottom? John L. Sullivan from Boston, Massachusetts. Does that name ring a bell to anybody? Yes, boxer. He was known as the Boston Strong Boy, the first boxing superstar, and one of the world's highest paid athletes. John L. Stayed at the Gibson House. This one, the King of Tramp. So this is one of the troops that came to perform at the Opera House. They all signed in there, and their company was called the King of Tramps Company. They would travel around the country just performing at the different opera houses. And again, you know, just about every little town had an opera house where these people would come and perform. That was their entertainment. They would have people come in that were speakers and just talk to people. And they would write about how they talked and how great their talk was and all for an hour or so. Here's another company, the New York Comedy Company would come in. I mentioned our opera house is still there, and down in the basement of the opera house, some of these people would sign their names down in the basement of the opera house. They're still there. There's a stage on the opera house, and back, what year do you think that canvas was made?
20s.
In the 1920s, they made a big canvas for the opera house, and it was a vision of how they saw Milford in the year 2000, say. And it was full of skyscrapers and everything. It's kind of neat. And it's still there. The guy that owns it, Peter, he's maintained it and everything. And every now and then they'll open it up for people to come in and see it. He did postcards of that. Remember the postcards? I should have a picture. Now this was a neat one. See the bottom signature? John D. Rockefeller, New York. I don't know if it's the real John D. Rockefeller, but it's there.
We live in a Rockefeller house.
This one I kind of took a copy of, because right in the middle there's Chief Utah Wana. So I'll tell you about the chief. He was known as the great Indian chief of medicine, the one-armed doctor, and the lightning champ tooth puller. He was basically a medicine man. He would sell this, you know, toxic water as cure-all kind of thing. He had numerous run-ins with the law, had several wives and girlfriends and assaults and practicing without a license kind of thing. But he was there doing his show one day, and probably at the Opera House, and stayed there. But he was such a strange kind of guy. He's actually in the computer, if you look him up. He was known around the country. The second name down is Jeffries. He was one of the owners of the Gibson House. And you can see he wrote his name on the top there. So I'm thinking this is when he first came in. So the guest register has George Hance, I guess it is, the proprietor. And then Jeffries came in and he made a big deal about signing it and changing his name on the top. And then he was related to Buzzard, who took over after him. Kathy and I were looking at this earlier, and as you look through the guest books, so many of the names are familiar in there. I see Van Sickle on the bottom there, Sigafus family, Cole family. There's so many names that are still prominent in the area. There's John Regal up the top there from the paper mill. Kuglers were popular down in Kingwood and Frenchtown area. Steve Ballott's related to the Kuglers from Artie's side. There's our Buzzard. He was another owner. Doc Buzzard. He was an owner of the Gibson House. And this is just a book of typical people staying at the Gibson House. This is Christmas Day at the Gibson House, so they must have had a big Christmas party. People from all over came.
What year is that?
I think it's 1902, something like that. Can't quite make that out up top. So most of the people that came to the Gibson House, just like most of the people that stay with us, are just normal people, doing business, shopping, taking the train somewhere. But the thing that's important is for 150 years that hotel was there, and they literally had people from mostly around the country. Back then you didn't have a lot of people from around the world coming and going. On the wall out here they have a bunch of historic things for the county, and one of them was the Flemington Vigilance Society poster. I put a marker in the book here. A lot of the people that stayed at the book, they would have their meetings, their quarterly meetings. The bank would have their quarterly board meetings. Well, we had an Alexandria Vigilance Society that would meet every quarter at the Gibson House. Their whole purpose was to get horse thieves. You know, and again, that's something that we can't associate with, but that was a big deal back in the 1900s. The railroad would have quarterly meetings at the Gibson House. And as you go through, you see a lot of railroad people. A lot of their crew would stay at the Gibson House. They would bring crews in to work, especially if there was an accident near Milford. They needed a place to stay to get the accident cleared up. But mostly they were normal people. There's Duckworth, that was another prominent name in the area. A lot of people from Milford. So that's where the Gibson House was. That's our drive-in bank in the center of town. That's where the Gibson House is. The little parking lot to the right, the red car, that's where the horse stables were. So the history of Milford is, because we had the paper mill, it was a very, very prosperous town, one of the most prosperous towns in the area. And their town leaders were really hot stuff. And in the 1950s, as people came out of the war, they were buying cars and building everywhere, World War II. We needed a drive-in bank. The big paper mill that we had in Milford for years, where there was no parking lot there. There was all houses there. They had their own village there. After the war, all these people started showing up with cars. They didn't know what to do. So they moved a lot of those houses out to the road between Milford and Frenchtown, and they tore a lot of them down to create a parking lot. Well, the town leaders of Milford said, we desperately need a drive-in bank. And so where could we put it? Right in the center of town across from the bank. So they decided we're going to tear down the hotel and put the drive-in bank. Milford, like Frenchtown, had two hotels. The Gibson House, where the drive-in bank is, and where the Catholic Church is, their big community center, that was the Milford House Hotel. We had two hotels. Our town leaders made decisions to tear them down and build a bank or build a church. Frenchtown town leaders never had that choice or discussion. They did nothing. And as it turned out, you know, who made the right decision? So the two hotels in Frenchtown are one of the neat things that makes Frenchtown great the way it is. And how we wish we would still have the Gibson House in Milford. One of our favorite cities in the world is Bruges, Belgium. And Bruges is so neat because it was like a Venice way back. But the sea receded from Bruges, so it wasn't a seaport anymore. And when the sea receded, they did nothing for 1,000 years. The city of Bruges is like it was 1,000 years ago, and it's what makes it famous today. So sometimes town leaders, hope you're listening, Marcia, sometimes town leaders, in an effort to leave their mark on things, we need a drive-in bank. They think it's so great, and it was important to the town, but man, they could have picked a better spot, right? They could have picked a different building to tear down. And so we made some bad decisions. I mean, you look down the road, is how's this decision going to affect us 50 to 100 years from now? That was definitely a bad one. So that's where the Gibson House was. So that's the history of Milford and the Gibson House guest register.
Just one thing I wanted to tell you, is that Colonel Lowry's body was sent back to England a number of years ago. I don't know if you remember the year.
He's not at the Old Stone Church?
No, Colonel Lowry, I'm not Colonel Lowry, Colonel Cornet Geary's body, I'm sorry. Cornet Geary's body was his family in England had it and taken it up. And
Let's research that, because I
It
read
was
the
like
family
in the-
definitely came, but they decided to leave him there.
no, I'm pretty sure he went back to England, was buried there.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that picture you have of the monument, it's interesting because when that was subdivided, the planning board in Raritan Township insisted upon the monument being set where where the grave, the grave was there and the body was there.
Yeah.
And then Hovnanian came in the dark of night and plowed the whole thing up and moved everything. And the planning board had them basically try to put it back where it was, but I'm just wondering, those trees were very young at the time, and I don't know if we would be able to figure out where it was supposed to be.
Well, the thing that's interesting about his body, so I mentioned he came from a prominent family. His dad was an admiral. That was way back in Revolutionary War time. You know what year his family came over to kind of look?
I want to say it was in the 90s, it was before the Hovnanian development.
1900s was when his family came over, and they actually dug it up, and they found the buttons from his uniform, so they knew it was him. But that was like more than 100 years later. The
I
family.
thought it was later that they did take it, but John Poole knows.
Yeah.
He's the guy who can tell me the year.
Good.
So, and I'll email it to you, because I'm pretty sure the body went back. But that, the original monument, there's two monuments. There's one in Geary's Ridge subdivision, and there's another one almost right on Route 202, next to, what the heck is there? It's like an equipment center or something.
The
You're
luggage
dri-
factory?
It's not too far from the luggage factory, but
It used-
and that monument was, actually the original one that was put up. But it's all very, very confusing, but, we are planning for the American Revolution celebration in 2020. We're doing, 18 months of it, so, cause there's so much to talk about in Hunterdon County. We're gonna go July of 2025 through the end of 2026, with, there's like 55 historical partners that are participating in this, as you know, because I think you're on my invitation list. Milford certainly is there. And, we're hoping to do a reenactment of the Dragoons, the Queen's Dragoons coming, and, we're gonna do, we're hoping for a whole weekend on Geary's, the Battle of Scourge, the skirmish, the siege of Geary's Ridge. But that is open to the public. If you're ever in the Raritan Township area, you go down on Route 202 and you see Geary's Ridge's sign, you can turn into the subdivision and just drive around, and you'll see this crazy set of steps that goes up to nothing, and it's all open to the public. You can walk up that set of steps and keep walking, and you'll get into a path through some trees, and it opens up to the best place that the Raritan Township Historical Society, or Historical Committee, I think they are, could figure out at the time where to put it back. So, that is there,
So
but
we don't think he's there. I'll do some more
John
research.
Poole.
Okay.
John Poole can, I'm gonna email him.
I've got a bunch of old pictures here for you to look at. Most of them are Freeland photographs. And as Marcia mentioned, I have some calendars. The Milford Historical Society, for the first time ever, took a bunch of Freeland photographs and we made a calendar for next year with some of the write-ups from the Milford newspaper, and the county certainly has some things there for sale.
Rob, did Eleanor Roosevelt stay there, or did she stay at the Milford Hotel? Where did she stay when she came?
I don't know, I didn't see her. She might be in the book, I didn't see her, yeah.
Eleanor Roosevelt, when she
Supposedly
came,
she's in the book.
Which hotel did she stay in? Supposedly she's
Well, there
in
were
this
two
book.
hotels.
Right,
Yeah.
supposedly she's in that book.
Maybe one was full.
Does anybody have any questions for Rob?
How many rooms did the Gibson house have?
Don't know. But
Looks like a big
it
place.
must have been a lot, because a lot of people would be staying there, yeah.
Anybody else?
Where did you
No.
call their Roosevelt stay, which hotel?
We thought it was the Gibson, that was what, we think her signature's in that book. But it's really hard to read, like, there's a lot of signatures in that book, and some of them are really hard to read. So, I don't know how neat her signature would be.
When was it?
You know, Dave?
I'm sorry, it was around,
Roosevelt came, supposedly?
here, I don't know.
I mean, her husband was in office at the time, so,
She came to the Doric House in 1953, but I can't say when she was,
when she was in Milford.
yeah,
You know?
I can't say if she stayed in Milford when.
There's some neat books that have been written about the train in front of our house. It was called the Old Beldell. And during the war, Roosevelt passed through Milford 3 times. And one of the neat stories in the book was Admiral Dewey was in the train. He was on one of the Pocono Express trains one day, and a lot of people came out in Milford to wave at Admiral Dewey, and the train went by at 70 miles an hour. They don't know if he got to see him or not, but they were waving. But they actually would document in the old newspapers who was in the train. And people have written a book about all the stuff, you know, on the history of the railroad and everything. There's 2 books on the Beldell, 2 kind of neat. It's amazing how many people love railroads. And I don't know if you all know, but just north of us in Regalsville, they just recently got a $1 million grant to rebuild all the tracks there and the railroad station. So for the first time in 60 years, this summer, they had passengers coming to the Regalsville, New Jersey Railroad Station. And it sounds exotic, but they came from Phillipsburg. So in Phillipsburg, you buy your train ticket and they bring you down to Regalsville and you get off and they give you a wine tasting tour and everything. It's kind of a neat thing. But to see the train coming back, and a lot of people get off and walk across the bridge over to the Regalsville Hotel and everything. Our group down in Milford, we're sad that the train, you know, we've lost a lot of interest in the train because it's all been up there in Regalsville. But the way I look at it, it's $1 million closer to getting to Milford. So the hope is they want to get that passenger train rebuilt all the way down to Milford. The tracks kind of end in Milford right now. Yes?
So there are railroad tracks that go along River Road between Milford
Yes.
and Palm Township. Is there actually a train that still uses that?
Yes. You know, when the paper mill closed,
Okay.
that was basically the end of the train. Most of the time we lived there, it was a working train that would come in from Canada. So once you got to Phillipsburg, those tracks connect to the whole world. So most of the time we lived there, trains would come in from Canada with supplies and take the paper goods up. And Updike Lumber used to get all of its lumber from Canada there. When the paper mill closed, that was the end of the train coming to Milford.
So
Years ago, they took the tracks up from the paper mill in Milford south. So when you go down to Frenchtown and Stockton, it's all a path now. But that train used to go all the way down to Trenton, to Beldell. And I mentioned earlier, people would get on the train and go to work in New York. They would go down to Trenton and catch the Northeast Corridor, north or south. So there's people working, now that it's not a commercial train anymore, they're working on bringing a tourist train, a passenger train back. They got to Regalsville, and their goal is to get to Milford. You can still bring a train down to Milford. The tracks, they've done a ton of work on them, so you could bring a train down to Milford. The key with the tracks is there has to be so many good ties for every stick of rail for how fast it wants to go. So if you want to do 70 miles an hour, you basically have to have every tie good. Right now, they can only do 5 miles an hour from Regalsville down to Milford on their little train. But their goal is to bring a passenger train back down to Milford someday. So dreamers like my wife and I at Milford, we see that whole stone mill by the bridge, and we see the railroad station, and we see the empty buildings there, and we see the railroad tracks. At some point, that will all be developed as riverfront property with the train coming down and the footpath. They're working on bringing the footpath from Frenchtown up to Milford where the tracks used to be. So it could be kind of a neat thing. It's such a slow process, you know. And the people that own the railroad and the grist mill in Milford are very difficult to work with. So that's our goal, Will. Yes?
You know about trains hitting people, and I'm just reminded of an old memory from like 30-something years ago, reading some ancient text where the woman was widowed 3 times. Her name was Har, maybe something like that. And her husband at the time, they were walking with the kids, and he decided to cross in front of the train. And to this day, they don't know whether he was like trying to see if he could make it in front of the train is like a thing, or he was suicidal or what.
Yeah.
But he stepped in front of the train on Sunday, or not Sunday walk, he stepped in front of the train when they were taking the walk. Bam, he was killed. Right in Milford. It was an old paper or something like that.
What was the name?
I can't remember this. I remember reading this in like the 1980s. Might have been Har or something with an H, but it's just too long.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, the lady that got run over in front of our house and the photographer, George Washington Freeland, they had both lost their hearing. We think Freeland, the photographer, lost his hearing in the Civil War. He was in the artillery division. The lady that got run over in front of my house, she lost her hearing from scarlet fever, so they couldn't hear. And if you can't hear and the train's doing 60, 70 miles an hour, it's easy to see how they could get run over. The thing that always amazes me is they didn't have cars. If these were horse and buggies, could you imagine being on a horse and buggy trying to cross a railroad track with a train doing 60 or 70 miles an hour? As I read a lot of the history of Milford, one of the big things they had was, we need a bell at the tracks to tell people a train's coming. We gotta have a bell. And so you read through the papers, and for weeks they're crying out, we need a bell, we need a bell. And I have pictures of the bell. They finally put the bell up. The bell was up like 3 weeks. We gotta get the bell out of here. It rings all the time. To know when the train, you're on a horse and buggy trying to cross the tracks with trains doing 60 or 70 miles an hour. The newspaper articles are full of, you know, the accidents they had and everything. It was just amazing. It was a rough life working on the railroad and the things that they had to deal with. We had a friend in town, Doris Snyder, still lives there. Her husband was a track walker. Okay? The railroad was like Google today. They just thought they were gonna rule the world for 1,000 years. People that sell houses, you have to get a survey, and they have survey markers. The railroad survey markers are stones. They're like 6 feet high that they bury in the ground with little crosses on them. That's how significant they felt they were. Doris's husband was a track walker. Every station had track walkers that were responsible for so many miles of rail, okay? They used to have contests to see who was the best maintained section of rail. When you look at old pictures of the railroad, they're like manicured. You don't see one weed. If the kids found a loose spike, they would go tell the track walker, and he would give them a penny. And they would have people come out and inspect the tracks. Part of the track walker's job was, I mentioned Roosevelt came by 3 times during the war. If anybody important was coming by on the train, he had to go out and make sure the track was okay. And Doris would tell me, she says, I don't know what Earl was supposed to do. All he had was a flashlight. Was he supposed to hit somebody over the head with the flashlight? But that was a big job back then, the track walkers. They were responsible for maintaining a track, and it had to be perfect. They got inspected all the time. And when you look at the pictures, they are perfect. But it was a big deal. And, you know, our country purposely made a decision to get away from the train and go to the highway after World War II. Most of Europe was so poor, they didn't have the resources to get away from the train. In fact, they said, to survive, we need the train. You could stay in any little tiny village in Europe today, and you still get on the train and go, you know, connects to the world. Our country got rid of the train, and you know, I think of, you know, Milford and Frenchtown today. Wouldn't it be neat to get on a train today in Milford and Frenchtown and go to New York or Philadelphia? Yeah. And once you lose it, you could never get it back. You know, it's just the way things are. So we're working to get the little passenger train back. There's so many people that love trains. When most of the time we lived there, the train was working. and they became dear friends of ours. I didn't find out until after the mill closed, the train stopped. They didn't get paid. There was only one guy on the train that got paid. They just loved trains so much. That was their life. And Pete, our buddy, he said it was the highlight of their week. Everywhere we went, people treated us like royalty. They would hold the babies up to look at the train. And we had guests. If guests showed up at our place and they really expressed a love for the trains, we would call the train guy. They would stop the train in front of our house and let the guy steer the train up a mile and come back down and drop them off. And so it was kind of a big deal. People love trains, and I think the success they're having with the train up in Regalsville shows that. And so someday we're hoping to get it down to Milford. Someday. Any other questions? Yes, dear.
This is not a question. From all my studies, I can see that at the turn of the century, certainly the Gibson House was the beginning of tourism. For as long as it was there were going to be some people, not all of them, there were going to be some people that are going to come in from other states and stay in these small towns. And people would do that in a flash today because they love it. And there's so many of our guests have marveled at how close it is and how wonderful that would be if they had a train. We had a friend who was an admiral, and his son was in the Navy. And he remembered riding with his father, picking up the train right at our train station in Milford, and being taken all the way in just one engine and car to the Pentagon.
They had a special Admiral train for them. That would come to Milford and pick up the Admiral. We have an antique fire truck in Milford. I don't know if any of you are fire people, but we have an antique fire truck, a 1935 from France. It came to Milford on the train. There's people that live in Milford in the 1950s and 60s that they bought a car. It came to Milford on the train. I mean, the train was everything then. But yeah, we had an Admiral train that come to Milford and pick up the Admiral and take him to the Pentagon. Yes?
What year did the paper mill close and why?
You could do a whole lecture on this.
A little story. I mentioned we have an inn. For 40 years we've been there. Our little business could kind of paint you a picture of the economy of our country. Most of the time we lived there, we had two sets of customers. On the weekend, we had all the romantics, like this weekend. During the week, we had all the business people from James River Paper, from Bethlehem Steel, from Ingersoll Rand, from Mont Blanc, from Kohinoor, from Exxon Research, from Frenchtown Ceramics, from Bluefish Clothing. They're all gone. All of those industries are gone. There are no more businesses in the area. There are no more business people. The paper mill got to a position, our country is big into the environment. To me, one of the best environmental success stories in the world is Northeast United States, where we live. That Delaware River in front of our house is one of the only rivers in the world that's cleaner this year than it was last year. There's not a place in all the world that's grown more trees in the last 100 years than Northeast United States. So there's been definitely a lot of good coming out of the environmental movement. But to knock on every industry's door, month after month, and say, we need you to spend $2 million to do this, we need you to spend $2 million to do that, it never ended. They were never satisfied with what the mill did. So you know what the mill did? They did what all the other mills in America did. They said, the heck with this. Let's go to Mexico or China where nobody asked us to do anything. Environmentally speaking, if you look at the globe as our environment, which we should, the worst thing we could have done was to force all those factories out of America, because they literally are doing whatever they want to do in places like Mexico and China and Vietnam. And so that they just couldn't keep up with all the environmental demands. No matter what they did, it was never enough. It never ended. And Marcia and I were talking earlier. Marcia was very instrumental when the mill did close to get something happening here to clean it up. We're still fighting with the state. They've spent over $15 million cleaning that property up. It's one of the best environmental success stories in the world, as far as very few Superfund sites come off the list. Our country has a deal about adding them to the list, not taking them off. That's one of the few Superfund sites that was coming off the list. At the last minute, the state raises their hand and says, we're not happy. There's people that want to buy it and clean it up, or fix it up. It's already been cleaned, but the state's still not happy with what's down there, and they want them to spend more money in another 5 years cleaning it up. So they closed because they couldn't keep up with environmental demands, and they made special papers there. One last story. Some of the guests that we got from the paper mill there was a huge disaster in our country, I don't know, 30 years ago, there was a hurricane or a flood or something, and it destroyed something, and they realized it was the only place in the world that made this that our country needs, whether it was a computer chip or part for an airplane, and they had a big panic in Washington. We can't have it where there's only one source of making this. We need to have two sources for everything just to protect ourselves. Somebody raised their hand and said, you know, for 200 years, there's only one place in the country that makes our currency. It's in Massachusetts. We need a second source of currency. Milford Mill was going to be that second source. We had a lot of people from the Treasury Department stay with us, and they would bring little samples, and they were working with the paper mill to make this currency and everything. Teddy Kennedy was the senator in Massachusetts at the time. He found out about it. He said, no, you're not taking any business from Massachusetts. And overnight, if that plan had gone through, I think that paper mill would still be there. But they were making currency for other countries. They made special papers. They made the paper for the Kodak films. They made the heat-resistant tiles for the first space launches and everything. Anything that was special. When you open your cereal boxes, the wax paper linings, they made all that stuff. They were like one of the leaders in the country for making food wrappers and everything in wax paper. All gone. Some of that equipment was so unique that people bought it and moved it to Mexico, and they're still making the same special paper on the same machine, but it's made in Mexico now, not Milford. So it was a huge loss. For 100 years, it was the biggest employer in the county. It was by far the biggest taxpayer in Milford, and we still haven't recouped from that. It's like we desperately need to recoup the tax loss that we did there, and it's been a slow process. We miss it. We miss our industry.
We need our industry.
Yeah.
So, thank you so much, Rob. What a fascinating talk.